Okay, so I want to cover, you can see where we are. We're on wrap up at November 26th. I want to cover the last chapter. We've covered basically, in one way or another, we've covered the whole book except for the last chapter. And the last chapter, as it is in many of the epistles, is kind of a wrap up of its own. And the way in which, when you're writing, you might write something, and then that last paragraph or that last page is somewhat of a kind of a summary of everything to kind of drive your point at the end. So let's go to that last chapter then, and then we'll circle back around to kind of an overall wrap up at the end. So I'd like to go ahead and jump in here, Hebrews 13, 7-9. Now, what I've done with these slides is just to put the scripture right on the screen. So we're just gonna, instead of individuals reading it, we're just gonna put it up on the screen and kind of discuss in a more in-depth sort of Bible study the words before us. So first of all, remember, this is where it begins. All right. I got these slides out of order. Give me a second here. All right. This is where I need to begin. I went the wrong way. Sorry about that. First two verses. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Many of us have heard this one before, this last line, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some have entertained angels without knowing it. So it's one of those sort of bumper sticker slogan type scriptures. It's really beautiful. It's pretty straightforward, but what's important is that first line, let mutual love continue. If you're reading through to the end of verse 12 or chapter 12, suddenly you can feel a switch, a change when you come to chapter 13. You can tell almost immediately that the writer is no longer sort of preaching the topics that has been through 12 chapters. And all of a sudden now there's this immediate feeling that the writer is summarizing or wrapping up, and he wants to now push some focus on things he wants to leave his hearers or his writer, the listeners with. So let mutual love continue. Well, what that tells us is that mutual love is already there, and he's asking for it to continue, and that's the first thing he says in this wrap up chapter is keep that going, right? And I can imagine Paul, saying similar things in his end statements with Ephesians and Galatians. Paul does a very similar kind of thing, and I know that that's how it is with me as a dad. When my son goes away for a weekend, I want to sort of say, listen, behave yourself. Right? There's these certain things you want to drive home before you wrap it up and leave. That's kind of how this feels, that first line right out of the box with chapter 13. Next thing we get here, let's study a little bit this do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers piece. There's a tie-in between let mutual love continue and do not neglect to go show hospitality. Hospitality here is an example of this mutual love. And so the writer is building one statement into the other. And it's worth mentioning that this particular love that manifests in hospitality in the second line, the Bible has lots of words for love. Paul might have used agape here. Mutual love being agape is that sort of love that is the higher order of love. It's sort of divine providence love. It's the love of God. But this love is more the phileo type of filio. It's brotherly love. It's the love between friends and family that we experience around our Thanksgiving tables this week. So it's not the same as that divine God-given love that is sort of the big blanket that God gives in sort of a covenantal approach to things. This is the love that they're saying between people, human to human type thing. And so even that gives us a kind of a break from the themes that we were in for 12 chapters. So now this love manifest in hospitality. The exhortation here is, do not neglect to show this to strangers. As we are today, even in those days, people were still rather suspicious or even hostile toward strangers. And yet, nevertheless, there's throughout the Old Testament, even into the New, there is still a kind of religious mandate that calls us to be hospitable out of this sense of love for the neighbor. And that's not just when Jesus calls us to love our neighbors. That is not just a New Testament thing. That is Deuteronomy and Old Testament as well. Jesus reconfigures it around himself and his sacrifice as the example. That's the change, and that we get that in John. But this idea, remember now, Hebrews are Jewish converts. So what the author is saying is really nothing new. He's just driving it home as a kind of exhortation as he's wrapping up his letter here. And it was also true in that region, the neighbors, the strangers might very well have been the population of the Roman citizens, the Greeks, as if to say, reach out beyond your Jewish friends and family and be hospitable with this love we have in community to the Greeks as well, right? And that's also a very Pauline kind of theme. So you see this common sort of thread throughout all of these epistles in this regard, at least. Now, the entertaining of angels is a fascinating kind of thing. And to the people of Hebrews, this is an allusion to a particular story in the Old Testament. Does anybody know what story I'm thinking of? In the book of Genesis, Abraham and Sarah, just before Sarah becomes pregnant, Abraham is visited by 3 strangers. And those 3 strangers sort of come out of nowhere. Abraham shows this kind of mutual love and hospitality to them. And he goes to Sarah and he says, I want you to make up some food and bring the best we have for these 3 strangers. And then as these 3 strangers are meeting with Abraham, suddenly the story sort of changes from strangers into angels or some sort of angelic messengers from God, because they tell Abraham that Sarah's going to become pregnant. And Sarah comes out and laughs in the scene, right? And then and that's why they name the child Isaac, because Isaac means to laugh, right? So this scene of the 3 sort of Trinitarian element of God visiting Abraham is just this well-known, powerful story from Genesis. So when the writer here says, for by doing so, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Abraham didn't know he was entertaining angels. He was entertaining strangers. And it turned out that these were the very messengers from God. So that story is behind these words in the mind of the hearer of the book of Hebrews, these Jewish folks. and that would have resonated with them. So this message of just being hospitable, now, even though that word love is the brotherly love, now with that entertaining angels piece, it takes on that greater kind of commitment, covenantal love from God in the language and the allusion that that the writer gives to the hearer of that. Now, I'm about to go to the next slide, but I want to point out, make a point here that'll bridge between the next slide. Any questions, though, about this thus far? Okay. All right. So, the interesting thing here is when we go to the next piece, we're gonna talk about that slide that got out of order the first time, and it's 13, 7, and 9. The interesting thing is, while this exhortation would tell every Christian to be welcoming and hospitable to strangers, just a few verses later, all right, we're going to find a bit of conflict with that on a particular point. And so, so with that, then let's go ahead. There we go. Now I'm in the right order. So notice now, I want to jump right up to verse 9 on this. So I'll go ahead and read it. The numbers aren't in here, but remember your leaders, those who spoke the word of God to you, consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Do not be carried away by all kinds of strange teachings, for it is well for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by regulations about food, which have not benefited those who observe them. All right. Here's the point I want to make. On the previous slide, in the first few verses of chapter 13, the writer is exhorting us to be hospitable to strangers. Now, notice this line here. Do not be carried away by all kinds of strange teachings. There's a conflict here, right? And it's not really a conflict except two sides of the same coin. There's openness in the opening statement, openness to foreigners, strangers, everybody different, to express faith and come into union or communion even with people that are different. But that openness closes when it's to foreign or strange doctrines or teachings. Remember now, one of the themes of Hebrews, one of the purposes for the writing altogether is to help converted Jews from resisting the temptation to go back to the old ways of doing things. So here the writer is saying, do not welcome these foreign or strange teachings or doctrines, or don't let strangers erode your faith. So on one hand, welcome with all hospitality the strangers. That's a kind of coming into the church, coming into the fold, right? But on the other hand, do not reject, reject, do not welcome or reject any stranger who would come to you the other way now, come to you with a false teaching, or don't go and leave the fold heading after false teachings or teachings that are contrary to what keeps us strong in the faith here. So it's very interesting how that openness in the first few verses closes down real quickly in verse 9. Does that make sense? And so if there's anything we Christians might want to be very cautious of, is being the text would here at least suggest when our openness to others becomes too open to the point of permitting false teachings to erode our faith. So that's one of the values. I want to say that's one of the real values. That's one of the real reasons why it's important we Lutherans hold that it's important for your pastors to be well educated. And I'm not lifting myself up. We all have to go through the same teachings here, right? I mean, not every group of Christians require their pastors to have a master's degree in some form of theology or Lutheran teaching in some sort of way. We cannot be ordained if we haven't met the educational criteria, and the reason for that is to protect from the foreign teachings, even from myself teaching some foreign thing into the church that would erode the faith. Okay. And so that's where, that's where sort of the buck stops here. Openness to all people. But if that openness begins to welcome teachings that erode what we believe, that's where we put a stop and say, no, you can't bring that in here. Make sense? And so that's where it's coming from with Hebrews. And it's an important distinction to understand, because we are very open, but it is openness to a point, and it's worth mentioning that point. And Hebrews is drawing a fine line here. Any thoughts or responses to that?
Yeah,
Susie or Yogi, did you guys have a question? Your mic came on.
Yogi started to talk, and I said they can hear you. So I don't know
okay, that's fine.
I don't know what he was going to say.
That's fine. Yeah. Sure.
What happens? I don't know how to say this. What happens when the Jehovah's Witnesses visit you?
Visit you at your home?
Yeah. How do you handle that?
Yeah. I've had Jehovah's Witnesses to my home. I say with all irony, they love me. Because we can entertain, I can listen, and then I can push back as well. And without being inhospitable, without being uncaring. But I can let them know, look, I just don't believe this that you're preaching, and I'm sure you're a fine individual, and I appreciate you having this chat with me at my door. But we're believers in a different direction of things, and that's as far as we're going to go. I mean, so I've had the brochures in my house and so forth, and even one time at my other house when we were over there, there were two wonderful young ladies who came to my house and wanted to leave me the stuff and come back next week. And I said, sure, come on back next week. We can continue this conversation if you wish, right? But I'm not budging, right? And that's where you draw the line. So I'm open, I'm hospitable, I care about you, but I'm not believing what you're bringing. And so that's where Hebrews is saying, be hospitable, be caring. You might be entertaining angels, right? But if you're bringing a teaching that's eroding your faith, no, we're going to put up a strong wall here. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Well, I've had the occasion when the Jehovah's Witness came to the door and got on the book of Revelation, which it was down my alley. And they said, isn't it horrible? The world is going to end. And I said, it's great. Jesus is coming again. And that was the end of that story.
Yeah, I love when they come to your door, and one of the things they say if you were to die today, do you know what will happen? Do you know where you're going? And I look at them and go, yeah. With full confidence, right? And so yeah, I mean, the other thing is folks that come into the church, right? I had one occasion one time, and this isn't really false teaching, but it could have opened the door for it. So I had an occasion one time where a member of my church brought a friend, and that friend was very inebriated at my church on that morning. And it was noticeable. And they came up for Holy Communion, and he's the gentleman was being verbally obnoxious, sort of saying, "This is bullshit," as he's coming up to communion,
Wow.
verbally saying he doesn't believe this stuff. And everybody was being very tolerant. When he came up for communion, I denied communion to him.
Wow. Yeah.
On one level, he'd already had too much alcohol. Now, I could have given him the grape juice, but anyone who is speaking against the gift that they're receiving, if I give it to them in the face of that, I am giving it now to his detriment, rather than to his comfort. The proper posture for Holy Communion is the contrite heart, needing the grace that the communion offers. Now, not all of us are in that perfect state of mind, so there's lots of grace here, but this man was way beyond grace, and it was noticeable to everyone. And I wasn't going to turn him away and have the police take him out of my church. It wasn't to that extent. It could have. It wasn't to that extent. But I denied him Holy Communion because I believe that in that particular situation, to give it communion under those circumstances would have been to his detriment, not to his benefit. And that is the teachings of our church. That is standing up for what we believe, that this thing we do is holy and sacred, and to speak against it as you're coming to me, I couldn't give it to him. The other time that I upheld teachings of the sacraments, for that matter, was I had one time where I had a mother who wanted their grandchild baptized, and so the grandmother sent to me her, I think it was daughter and son-in-law. So I didn't know daughter and son-in-law, but they're sitting in my office, and I did the same thing I do every time. I show them the promises that they'll be asked to make before God in a congregation on behalf of their child. And I asked them, in good conscience and good faith, are you willing to make these promises? And the husband said to me, he said, "To tell you the truth, Pastor," he said, we're just here because of Grandma. We don't really believe this stuff."
Wow.
Right. And I said, well, look, if you don't believe these promises and you're not able to make these promises, and at least in good faith and good conscience, I can't baptize your child, because that's the key. That's one of the key elements: water, word, and faith. If you're telling me there's no faith, then what I'm about to do isn't genuinely a baptism. So I got to have these three components, and at least, and honestly, because I knew the wrath of Grandma was coming at me when I told them no, I would have preferred they lie to me, right? I mean, just lie to me and say, sure, we're going to go through the motions of this. That lets me off the hook. But they were honest, and I had to honor then where we were going. Now, here's the good news of that story. I directed them at that point. I said, I can't at this time baptize your child, but I want to encourage you to seek out, your own path of faith. Maybe this Lutheran path is not yours, but for the sake of your own journey and your own faith, seek that out. They came back to me a year later, and
Wow.
said they began going to a much more sort of charismatic evangelical form of Christian church, and they found a home there, and they had their child baptized there. Actually, it wasn't baptism now, it was committed so that they get baptized later. But whatever the case, they found their Christian journey, and they came back and thanked me for sort of nudging them to do so rather than baptizing their kid. You see, and that's where it would have been to the detriment, right? Had I baptized the child, now that little nudge that they needed to find their own path wouldn't have happened. So that's part of what's embedded here, that there's a certain openness we have, but we cannot be open to people who or folks who want to come into our church and lead us down paths that would erode our faith. That's where we're no longer hospitable. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Jim.
Uh, I heard a pastor say it once, which keeps coming back to mind. All are welcome who profess Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior.
Yeah.
Well, that welcomes everyone who believes, period.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's an importance to that. And every little thing we do to, to take advantage of grace against the teachings of our church start to erode the faith of our community. And then when we really need the strength and the reverence that's important for our faith, we find it hard to find. It becomes hard to find. So I think we've kind of covered it pretty well. But are there any other questions here about this?
Well, I was thinking about what I would say to Jehovah's Witness that would come to my door, and it would be something to the, like, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord as Lutherans.
Yeah.
I respect that you believe what you believe, but
Yeah.
this is what we're doing.
Yeah, and it's okay to recognize, even, to say something like, our God has many facets of the way in which we can all appreciate what God is up to in this world and find God's path. Like a diamond has multi-facets, right? I mean, we're of that Lutheran facet. Other people are of the other facet. And we can all be part of this gem of what God is up to in the world, right? That's another little analogy to use for that. And Luther himself would tell you, the moment we Lutherans claim that we're right, we're the ones wrong. So we don't have it. We don't have the corner on righteousness either. We just act like we do. So, well, anyway, that's just playfulness. So that's well said, Kathy, and I'm glad you offered that. Is there anything else? This is an important point, and I'm glad we're hitting it pretty hard.
You were saying about the guy who came into your church inebriated. Maybe you should have just taken him and submerged him in water. Maybe he would have come around.
Yeah, that wouldn't have been appropriate in the time there, Sandy. Yeah. So there are some other elements of this text before us, before we change slides here. And if we take the first slide, we had verse 1 and 2, and then and we skipped verses 3 through 6. But if we took 1 through 9 as its own container, and sort of summarized it, you would get something like this: that having emphasized faith in God through chapters 11 and 12, the writer now in this first part of the last chapter calls for faithfulness in our dealings with all people. And that faithfulness reflects the love of God, and it reflects the reverence and the importance of upholding the faith as well, so it doesn't erode. And that then is true, and this is the summary of the verses we skipped, in money, in marriage, and matters to do with all of our sort of teachings of Christ, as we've mentioned. And so those verses I skipped them because I thought we could just quickly summarize. So if you take verse 1 through 9, you get these sort of container, 1 through 2 and 7 through 9 as the bookends or the container piece. And in the piece in the middle is all the contents of where in which we and to whom in which we live this way. All right. So that brings us then to 10 through 12, where we start to get more of a reflection of that magnificence theme that was central to the whole book of Hebrews. We have an altar from which those who officiate in the tent have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest as a sacrifice for sins are burned outside the camp. Therefore, Jesus also suffered outside the city gate in order to sanctify the people by his own blood. Now, we have an altar. I read lots of commentary on this because this we is tricky. If the we refers to we, the church, then what follows doesn't quite make sense. Because if you take it that way, we have an altar, we, the church, have an altar from which those who officiate in the tent have no right to eat. That piece is more in sync with the priests of the Jewish faith in the Old Testament. So for some strange reason, the author decides at this point, and no other point in the book, to sort of align himself with those that he's trying to prohibit his readers from drifting back to, which also seems a little quirky, right? Now, the other thing is that the pronouns in the ancient language can also be a little tricky sometimes. So this could be just a translational glitch. But this we is a little, makes what follows tricky, because who is this we? And most of the scholars I read say that the we is the author aligning himself with the congregation who remembers their Jewish roots. And now this we, before receiving Christ, we have an altar from which those who officiate in the tent have no right to eat, which is true in that case. The priesthood would go in and they would take the offering and they would burn it on the altar, and they would give it back to some of it would be given back to the one who gave it to take back to their family, and as they eat it, it would be the blessing would go back to their family, and then otherwise it would go into the Holy of Holies and be used there as a kind of way in which it was perceived to sort of offer something back to God. But for the most part, it was the aroma that went up into the air that was seen as sort of a spiritual exercise or experience of receiving the blessing, that as the aroma goes up and it spreads around, God is blessing the people who gave this. And so in this regard, then there's this altar from which those who officiate, the priest in the tent, have no right to eat. So then what follows? For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So this is kind of an interesting thing that takes a little bit of an understanding of what is this camp that he's talking about. Well, there are parts of the temple. You may have heard this before, but there's the inner Holy of Holies, which is that when you see pictures of the old temple, that's that little cupola thing on the top of the temple. The temple is actually a large sort of courtyard around that as well. And then there's another outer ring. So the inner ring is just for Jewish people and the priests, and that's where sacrifices take place. So the outside camp in that regard is the altar is outside the Holy of Holies. All right. So it's sort of outside. In that regard, the camp is the inside Holy of Holies. So outside the camp of the tent, the altar sits where you would burn, and then it would be taken in if necessary. And now, so then the next verse, therefore Jesus also suffered outside the city gate. So the tie-in here is that Jesus' sacrifice was very, very much like then the sacrifice of that which the priests do. And just as the altar with the sacrifice is outside that Holy of Holies, outside the camp, Christ was sacrificed outside the city gate in order to sanctify the people that are inside the kingdom, inside the city. And that was done by his blood. And so you get that sort of, that same thread of that magnificence of Christ here, pointing to us that Christ is the sacrifice that is a greater sacrifice than anything the priests do. And this one actually points us to Holy Communion that was being practiced in the time of the Hebrews in its earliest form. But in the first century of Christianity, the difference is that there was no priest. There was the high priest Christ, and then you would have the host around the table sitting in and would remember what Jesus did, and they would remember and utter with memory from the words of Christ at the Last Supper. This is, Jesus said, "This is my body." Jesus said, "This is my blood," and they would share that. The difference, however, that he's pointing to, if the "we" is translated correctly, now around this table, even the one who's sitting in as a kind of priest in this moment gets to participate in and eat what is also rightfully theirs. So the first line, if we translate "we" correctly, follows up with the last line in a way of drawing a full circle now. And later on, we'll get the theology of the priesthood of all believers. That's not in Hebrews, but we're getting pretty close to it with this line. All right? Okay. Let's carry on.
There's
So,
a
we get a glimpse
comment.
of the Eucharist here. Go ahead.
There's a comment about from Martin Luther about these verses, and it's in my Lutheran Study Bible. What is the theology of the cross? Martin Luther pointed out that God often works in the most unlikely ways, showing strength in things that are seen as weak and showing glory in things seen as shameful. In Jesus, God is not revealed in the holy sanctuary, but outside the city walls on a cross. This shameful way of dying becomes holy because of Christ's suffering and obedience. This sacrifice takes away sins once and for all.
Yeah. So just as the scapegoat, literally, or the beast, was given on the altar that would burn outside of the holy camp, the Holy of Holies, Jesus was sacrificed outside the camp as well, but outside the city. And that's my take on what you're reading in your Lutheran Bible there, Kathy. That and Hebrews is drawing a connection there and choosing words carefully to do so. So we also get kind of a glimpse of the Eucharistic theology here as it's beginning to form too, in the early stages. Anything else? Okay. What time is it? I don't see for some reason the clock that's usually on my computer screen is not visible.
6:57.
Holy cow. How time flies. All right. Hebrews 13, verse 20. Now may the God of peace, who brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant, make you complete in everything good, so that you may do his will, working among us that which is pleasing in his sight through Jesus Christ, to whom be the glory forever and ever. Amen. This is just a beautiful kind of summary of things, and that wraps up the letter with a nice benediction, right? You could even put these lines in any worship service as a benediction at the end of worship, and it would be perfect. And it summarizes the whole book, right? Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant. Now, these are the themes that he's already pointed out. Jesus is the good shepherd. The blood of the eternal covenant, not the covenant that is just for now, but an eternal covenant. Make you complete and everything good so that you may do his will. These are the themes of the book that sort of thrust into a benediction. It's a nice, neat bow that the writer finishes off the work with. There's a little PS at the end after verse 20 that is, it's literally a PS. It's sort of like, oh, by the way, Timothy will be coming to you soon as he's released from prison. It's weird because we don't know who Timothy is. If we think of the Timothy like Paul and Silas and Timothy, and the Timothy that Paul writes to, right? Well, to our knowledge, that Timothy was never in prison. So either he was, and we don't have any other record of it, or this is a different Timothy that they're referring to. So it's a little PS at the end of the letter. All right. So wrapping up here, I hope that this has been rewarding for you. I hope that you see the book of Hebrews now in a whole new light. And I hope that those introductory questions, going back to that one statement I have on the thing, Martin Luther had doubts about the canonicity of Hebrews. Why? Well, I hope we sort of understand why. It's a complicated, difficult book to read. Studying it together still opens up some really challenging questions like, can grace be lost? And is there an unforgivable sin? Hebrews leans in toward these topics and leaves you sort of needing more Bible books to help understand and get us through them. And so, you can start to understand why Luther and other reformers were very concerned about including Hebrews in the canon, because they knew for the first time they were going to make sure that people were going to read the Bible in their own language, and they were being very cautious and actually a bit pastoral in those days. So I hope that you also got a glimpse of how different this book of Hebrews is. The audience is different. The messaging is different than anything else you've read before. So ultimately, the primary themes are the writer writing to a group of Jewish converts in a way that he's attempting to help them bolster their faith so that they don't slide back into the roots from which they came of faith. And he's teaching them throughout of the magnificence of Christ, and then, of course, the humanity of Christ. So those three things really are the centerpiece and the purpose for the book, and then the themes that the author uses to drive that purpose. The purpose is to keep people from sliding back out of the church into their Jewish ways, and the theme that he drives home to do that is that Christ is the magnificent one who's greater than any of the people in the Old Testament, right? So that's in a nutshell, kind of what we've been talking about. What are you taking with you? Is there any lesson that jumps out over these last 6 weeks, 7 weeks, that is something that you're going to cling to that made a difference for you?
Any questions?
I just stumped you. Well, I don't have my clock in front of me, but I'm guessing it's 7 o'clock or thereafter. So instead of leaving us hanging on that, I'll leave you hanging with that question. What is it that you are going to take and apply to your faith that makes a difference to you from what we learned from this book of Hebrews? Is there one central thing? Is it a collection of things? Is it just the knowledge of this whole book and its uniqueness? Send me a message. I'd like to know how that's working with you. And next week we'll gather and we'll begin 3 weeks before we're run out of time in December because the following Tuesday will be December 24th. So hopefully we're all in church on that evening. I will be. And so what are angels? Next week we'll talk about that. And we'll dig into who and what are the angels of the Bible. All right. And so same link. If you notice there, it's the same link you've been using. So I hope you come on back for that. Anybody too busy in the month of December can't make it?
So the coffee is all brewed now.
Right. Wait, we're done with Hebrews, so the coffee's done. Yeah, right. So, yep. Now we're talking about angels. There are angels among us, right?
Yeah, right here.
Oh. Thank you.
Well, God bless you all. I'm so grateful that we're doing this. I wasn't sure how it would go using a Google Meet. This was a sort of a new idea for Bible study for St. Joseph's, and I feel like we're off to a good start. And I hope that as we continue to meet, the numbers will even grow, and we'll add to them. And I will continue to entertain any sort of feedback that you find helpful, or anything at all that you think you want to share with me about what you've learned or what you think of this. Okay. God bless you. All
Thank
right.
you. Bless you too.
We'll see you next time for angels.
Happy
Yep.
Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Happy
Thanksgiving, everybody.
Thanksgiving.